I'll tell you what freedom is to me. No fear. I mean, really, no fear.
Hi everybody, welcome to Abantu May. I am May. I would also like to say that first of all, if you're new here, my conversations are usually around decolonization, holistic decolonization, womanism, Black consciousness, and liberty and sovereignty in a lens that really focuses specifically on having a holistic approach to our decolonization and a womanist understanding of the world as well, because I understand that the world and the structures we have mostly have been shaped by a certain group of people, a certain gender, and that also in so many ways affects the ways that we experience oppression, whether it's racism, sexism, classism, capitalism. All the isms have an influence of those things. Who created them, for what agenda, and at whose expense. I'm really excited about the conversation I wanted to have with you today, and it's a conversation that is really sparked by recent events, particularly my own home country in Uganda, on the rights of gay people. I remember when I first had the news, I wanted to make an initial video, and I recorded a whole 30-minute video about what I was feeling, what I was going through. And to be honest, it was very emotional. And I'm a big believer within my own holistic practice that emotions are healthy and important. But I felt like, okay, I need to digest and process everything. And I made a video on my other channel, May in Bloom, which is more like how I saw it from my own personal experience and my own personal pains about the situation. But I think one thing that I wanted to particularly keep for this channel was a broader exploration of some of the hypocrisy that are used as reasons for homophobia in our African societies and cultures, not just in Uganda, and have a conversation around that, but as holistic and decolonial as possible, because I also believe that there is a lot of things that came into play that are affecting the way we see the current LGBT movement. And I would also say that it's not everything that I agree with everybody on each side. So I'm trying to have as balanced of an understanding of it, especially as a queer person myself, who doesn't really feel that I agree with everything on either the queer community or in the African, which is mostly seeing queerness from a religious perspective. This conversation was also very much influenced by a conversation I had with my mother, my very African Christian mom, and actually what has also helped me in not only grounding the perspectives I want to share with you with, but also diversifying them, was that after our conversation, we both agreed that she didn't know a lot about queer people because she only learned about them from people who had certain lenses of queerness. And those are really religious people, traditionalists, which often goes hand in hand with religious perspectives when it comes to at least my country of Uganda. And she didn't have a lot of space of knowing real queer people except for me. And even my own queerness is something she's only slowly coming into terms with. And also me as her daughter who loves her, but also believes that and understands that a lot of the way she sees me are very much influenced by her religious upbringing and views. And I try to have that understanding and see beyond it and understand that whatever she's doing and saying, in it somewhere there is the love for me, but also a lot of it is also based on the worldview that dominates her lenses of seeing me through. I was very proud of her because we didn't talk after we had that conversation, which really became emotional and heated, because these laws are not just affecting criminals, they're affecting everyday people. They're affecting people who just want to be left alone and love who they love. But the idea and the fear mongering around this community has been really well executed, and it's easy for people to be moved by what they fear and the worst of the group that they fear. It's how we start any genocides or any oppression of people. It's by painting them in these very simplistic, inhumane ways that just has a broad stroke on everybody with no nuances, no humanity, no diversity. And it's always interesting for me as somebody who comes from a country that is fighting against our own governmental oppression and the ways that our governments are very adamant on suppressing everyday citizen rights and access to a wonderful well-being in their own country. And also recognizing that my fellow countrymen and women are just as happy to pass on that oppression to another group. They think that's okay because that goes against their values. Well, it's interesting to see that we don't always see the ways in which we ourselves become oppressors while fighting against the oppression we feel or experience. And it's something that I always try to be humble about, because I think we are all blinded by our privileges, but also we are all blinded by the traumas of our oppression as well. So there is a necessity for us to question, like, in which ways is my pain or my privilege affecting the way I see this for its entirety. And I think we are all better off if we try to have more of that approach to the things that we find challenging or hurtful or scary. So my mom, and then she had sent me a conversation happening in Kenya by the Kenyan presenter called Lynn Ngugi. I think that's how you pronounce her name. And she was having a panel where people who are pro-LGBT rights and people who are against it were having a discussion on what their reasons were. And this was like a 2.5 almost conversation. So I was happy that my mom was doing research, and she said, I watched this video. It was really helpful. I got to see different perspectives and I'd like to share it with you. And today the second part came out because the first one was so well received. And I watched the second part and I finished it, and that was really nice. I think I've gained a more understanding of the fears and the perspectives that I used on the continent itself, because I think also as a child of the diaspora, sometimes we can take on the views of that are pretty westernized. Even as somebody who works with decolonization, I think it's easy to be influenced by your own ways of seeing and to not recognize that there is different conversations and fears happening on the ground itself. I try to listen to podcasts, to follow people who I know or feel have more of a diverse perspective, or even on YouTube from the continent, just to stay in touch with what's going on. If it's not my own people, my own friends, my upbringing and ways of seeing the world were pretty much very influenced also by my mom and African upbringing. But then I was also invited, because I grew up in the West, to supplement that with another perspective. And then as somebody who understands decolonization and the over-centering of Western ideals and perspective and enforcing those on other people, like we don't have to go just about colonialism or imperialism. We can also just go as back as the spread of modern democracy and how many countries that has destabilized. So I understand that there is an enforcement of worldviews that is constantly coming from one end to the other. And I understand the fears that my fellow countrymen and women might experience because they feel that this is a foreign thing invading them, without questioning the overall society that they live in and how much those structures have been influenced and sustained by old Western views and old Western systems of powers and oppression, but just that those have become familiar. So the new ones seem more alien, even though they all in some way have a form of alienness, because they did not sprung naturally from us as Africans, if that makes sense. I think I was going a very intellectual route, like researching most of the key points people were making. And this was based on comments on the Ugandan bill against gay people. And I was really surprised at the average day person that was condoning this and was very happy that this was taking place to protect African values, to protect what's natural, to protect us from Western agenda. There were certain things that were coming up, and my approach previously was I want to research the heritage of these things, the structures of these things, the history and the supporters of these things. But I think after watching conversations of everyday people, everyday, you can't really say that. Most of the panelists were people who are active in their community in a certain way. They're not everyday people. There were people who were either human rights activists or people who were pastors, lots of pastors and church people, psychologists. There were a lot of diverse enough perspective, I guess, to get an idea, and also people who just happen to be gay and maybe had a different profession. But I think I really loved listening to these conversations, these two in total. I think it's 5 hours of conversation. It gave me an understanding, not only what people were sharing, but the comments as well. And I came up with a few of the things that I think us as Africans do not see the hypocrisy in as defining as reasons why we disagree with the LGBT rights. As I said previously, I also don't feel that I agree with everything that is portrayed in Western LGBT community. And I think I'll make a proper video on that at another point. I think it's also important as members of the queer community, wherever you might be, to also speak up about the parts of it that we don't agree with, so that we're not all seen as the same, because I think that's the easiest way to make it easier for people to be put in a box and oppressed, is once you start believing that they all think alike, they all want the same thing, and they all feel that everything that the loudest members of them are pushing for is something that they all agree with. Have more people speaking up and saying, I'm part of the queer community, but I also don't agree with this or that or this, because we are different. We agree about different things. Just like a Black person, I'm not going to agree with everything a Black people think, or as a Ugandan woman, I'm not going to agree with everything a Ugandan woman thinks. We have to diversify the way we see the world and the way we are seen as people and the way that we exist in the world, because it's easier to manage something and control it and deem it as good and bad if you can put it in a nicely, neat box. And that's why even to start the oppression of a people, you have to reduce them to certain stereotypes, to certain extremities, to make sure that everybody is so heightened by the awful, fearful things about them and characteristics of them, that it's easier to dehumanize them and then be okay with oppressing their rights, their human rights, right? We saw that with the Holocaust, we see that with racism ongoing, we saw that with slavery, we saw that with the oppression of women. We've seen that in so many ways, that if you want to oppress a certain group of people, first minimize them to a few characteristics. I'd like to then just go through a few points that kept coming up constantly and how there is hypocrisy in that. I try to be very transparent about my own perspectives in life, not only the things I see the world from, but my own humanist perspective is very live and let live. If somebody is not causing or limiting your freedom to exist fully, then they should be allowed to exist as they want. I think as soon as we start as humans ganging up with each other to forbid that person or those kinds of people, let each other be, also fights against a lot of oppression and abuse that we could experience from one another, because it would require you to force something upon other people, whether it's your worldview, whether it's your sexual desires, whether it's your opinions, whatever have you. That simplicity of, I allow the humanity in you to exist as the humanity in you sees to be fit, as long as there is an understanding that you need to protect that for me as well, right? And yours never crosses mine, basically. Okay. So the first thing that is mentioned is Christian values. This is the idea that this goes against our values. And I think as Africans, it's very, even though Africa has, of course, different religions, the biggest ones are Christianity and Islam. And that is not a coincidence. There's a reason we don't have a lot of Buddhist or Hinduist. That's also a part that I think is quite interesting, that it's not always taken into account, that we're not these things just randomly because it's what is the truth and made the most sense to us. It's the things that came with our colonizers most of the time, or our invaders. So we are influenced by their worldview to some regard. So the hypocrisy in this, being against LGBTQ based on Christian values, is if you base your whole life on a book, why not also make an effort to understand the book itself? I think this is also how I lost my religion. I'm not saying that people should do that to lose their religion, but I was sincere in the fact that I wanted to understand how the book I was basing my worldview on actually came to be, because we don't believe that the Bible fell from the sky. It was inspired by God. And not only beyond that, there were certain books that were chosen. So then I had to question all those steps. How was it inspired by God? Who guaranteed that those writings were actually inspired by God? Like, God could bring down the 10 Commandments for Moses, but he couldn't bring down the full written book as he does rain and everything else. That always was a bit weird, because clearly the book is more important than rain. If you can make rain, if you can make mountains and everything, why wouldn't you also make sure the book fell down for all of us in the languages we understand, or signs we understood? So that was my first questioning. But also beyond that, it was also trying to understand in all the ways that there was a political and kind of certain interest in the way that it was collected, the books were put together, then I have to ask, who were those people? What power did they have? What morality did they have? Do I trust them to have the best interests of every human being on earth? Do I just trust that they knew God the most? So already there was a lot of fishiness in the way I understood the Bible and the way it came to be that made it seem less like this divine, unquestionable book, because there are so many elements that could go wrong, because humans are flawed, because humans have agenda, because humans have political perspectives that they want to enforce. It was hard for me to look at the book and just say that's a neutral messaging from God. That's why for me, it's easier to believe in a more natural, spiritual approach, because those things are constantly confirmed for all of us to see. We all understand air, water. We all understand that we need healthy soils to eat well. There's so many things that are constant, and we all understand that language regardless of where we live in the world, that I felt like that had a more stronger spiritual connection than maybe a book that I couldn't not only trust how it came to be, but trust how my people came to receive it, and trust the agenda that was brought with that. And another part of using Christianity and therefore the Bible, because now particularly in East Africa, it's mostly, at least Kenya, Uganda, all those countries, it's more Christianity that is the biggest religion. The reason that this is used as an excuse is also to say that we are fighting against certain agendas. But we understand that even Christianity coming to our countries came with people with a certain agenda. So everywhere Christianity went, people had their own spiritualities, people had their own traditions and values. And religion, specifically religion brought to you by the Bible, was brought to stamp on those beliefs and to belittle them and to make them less than what the Europeans and colonized brought with them. I saw that some people were arguing, well, it's not the same, because even though they came in this something that we can agree was bad, most Africans to a certain degree agree that colonization was bad. They feel that something good can still come from something bad, which is not something I think is fully wrong. It's true. Certain good things can come from things that are bad. But I also believe that it's also fair to recognize that this were not two things that were separate. You didn't just happen to learn to eat with forks and also happen to pick up Christianity. No, Christianity was actually used as a method to make colonization easier. They worked together. Making you believe in one thing, have a certain worldview was easier to manage, because like I said, if you want to control people, you have to limit all the ways that they're different and diverse. You have to put them in a simpler world, in a controllable world, in a worldview that they can all be under, so that if you control that worldview, you can control them easier. So it wouldn't be fair to argue that it's because our Christian values and pretend that the Christian values sprung from the Nile, the river Nile, out of nowhere. No, there's a history to how that came to be. There's a history of how that was enforced on us as African people. And there was an agenda to that being forced upon us, and ways of living that had tradition and knowledge that was vital and had been passed down through our ancestors, that were destroyed just because everything that wasn't aligned with Christianity was demonized, and only things that were aligned with Christianity were used and seen as the right way to exist, right? Most Christians, I think, would hate for Islam to then come and be pushed against them and say that your book is wrong and you need to see the world like this, you need to act like that, you need to follow the Quran, and the Bible is not what you should follow. Most Christians will agree that that is wrong. You do not enforce things on people. You do not, you should allow people to believe in what they believe in. But most Christians don't see, especially in these debates, they don't see that even how they came to be Christians was somebody's agenda that was pushed against them and destroyed the many other ways that people believed and saw the world, right? So I feel like that was a bit of a hypocrisy, that saying it's Christian values. But I also feel that if you are saying that it's in protection of Christian values, which is something I'll go more into when I talk about morality and keeping of morality, I would say that saying that this is protection of what the Bible teaches you to live with, I also think that it's quite interesting that we don't take it to mean everything the Bible tells us to live with. Because like I've said before, that according to the Bible, sins are not in hierarchies. All sins are equal. So why would you have so much focus on legitimizing through the law certain sins, but not others? Because you could agree that, yes, according to your book, being gay is a sin. Okay, but I don't believe in your book. but then saying that, no, but we don't want our society to accept you because we are a Christian society. But there are people in your society that are Muslim. There are people in your society that have other religions. Are you also going to enforce that and say that because we are Christians and we worship on Sunday, we do not want a law that allows you to worship on Friday or worship when you worship, because that goes against our values and it's a sin because our Bible told us that these are the days that are holy. This is when we should worship, right? That's not the case. Like, I don't like that there's no consistency in that way. Be consistent. If you're going to say we are against this, have the same energy for everything, right? And you don't. So it's hypocritical. But yeah, so basically understanding that using the Christian values, questioning where the Christian values come from, questioning where the Christian Bible comes from, questioning what was the agenda of even imposing that Christian values on us. And also knowing that if you believe in your values so much that you want to protect them and you would fight against other people, like let's say Muslim, Hindus, other people forcing their beliefs on you, why do you feel so comfortable using your beliefs to be enforced through legislations on other people? That doesn't make any sense. So I think another thing that is interesting to go under is people were arguing that this is a Western agenda. This is a Western agenda and there is funding behind it. I personally believe that everybody to some degree has an agenda. I always try to be clear about my agendas in the beginning of my videos. My worldviews kind of share the agendas I have and push. Everybody has an agenda. I make these videos, yes, because I want to share my own growth in decolonization and the views I have and the changes I go through. But my agenda is also to educate more people and to make sure that other people get to questioning. I think more than you agreeing with everything I say, I think it's just nice that you see somebody else who has the same background, who's a child of the diaspora, who grew up in a Christian upbringing, trying to make sense of that worldview, trying to unpeel the things that are not only foreign but oppressive that were put up against me, and trying to hold on to the things I find empowering, regardless if those things are found in my history or in my present or even in my current way of existing in a Western world. I think I want to inspire people to question, to understand that things are not just simplistic, little, finely boxed in things. Things have a history, things have agendas, things have powers of oppression and exploitation. So I would say that this is also a very important way that I can see this argument of an agenda, that a lot of the conversation is talking about Western funding that is encouraging people to be gay, number one, and forcing the gay lifestyle on other people. Whereas I feel like we all have, for example, lifestyles. I've already explained that I think everybody has an agenda to a certain degree. Christians have an agenda, Muslims have an agenda. Everybody has an agenda, right? But influence is different, on sharing is different than wanting to impose your worldview on other people. I don't know a lot of gay people, for example, that go door to door trying to tell you about their gayness, but I know a lot of Christians that do that. So, and we don't really talk about that, like how that is wrong and enforced. They're forcing their lifestyle on me. The amount of Jehovah Witnesses, for example, that would knock on our doors, like some of them we even befriended, and my mom would take that opportunity to share her worldview and her religion with them, which was really interesting. It's a funny moment of my childhood. But I would say that we can't be blinded to the fact that even you saying that you're afraid of this agenda, there's an agenda and it's being funded by the West. And I think if we're also trying to question agendas, okay, let's just agree to question what is the purpose of this agenda, because really that's what differentiates it from the ones you are pro, and so much pro you don't even recognize that you have an agenda, and the ones you're against and you're focused so much that this person has an agenda for me, right? But you both have an agenda. It's more if you agree with that agenda or not to some degree, right? I'm not saying that every time we interact with people, we're like, I want this to happen, da da da. But saying that that's the main reason, that's also a big reason why you are very adamant to fight against queer Africans, is also lacking of consistency, and it's hypocritical. Also because we know that a lot of funding for Christian movements and evangelistic movements who have also been part of rising this homophobia are also funded by Western churches, Western missionaries, right? that you don't talk about because it's aligned with your own agenda. And that's not fair. Yes, are there NGOs that are in favor of protecting the rights of gay people? And yes, could we argue that even as we can see it on the religious funding from the West, we can also see that, okay, there is maybe LGBT-focused funding from the West that is destructive to our African communities. I think that would be fair. Whether it's funding American evangelists working around the world to make sure that more homophobia is something that is incited more in formerly colonized countries that have taken on or were forced to take on Christianity, it's fair to question what are their intentions as well. It's also fair to question how this Western influence is inciting more hate and intolerance in our communities. It's not that gay people suddenly become more, but it's the way we see them. It's kind of like when you follow the history of the anti-abortion laws in America and you see how, of course, church played a big role in that, but it was also something political. It was something that they could use in political agendas to say, if you vote for me, I will be against those people who believe in this, right? But I also believe that when we talk about funding, especially Western funding, we should always question, regardless of what they're funding, what is their agenda? Because people seldom give, especially when it comes to the relationship between Africa and the West, we are seldom given things or support or help just because people are wonderful and lovely. Yes, maybe certain individuals, but there's also a need to control how Africa develops and which sentiments, which things it allows, which things it's pro. And yes, we can all agree that we need to be mindful of that and critical of that, but it's inconsistent and it's shameful to only care about that if it's funding, Western funding. You only care about Western funding being wrong if it's funding things that you yourself don't agree with, but you are blind to the ways that your movement is also being funded and supported by Western missionaries. Let's, as Africans, agree that let's be mindful in all the way that the West is investing in Africa and what the agenda of that is. We also know that there's a lot of Western funding coming to sustain those very governments that we are hoping can legislate our morality into the law, that are funding those governments that are oppressive to African people. So consistency, my friends, right? Another thing that I thought was very interesting was the argument of harmful to children. I think I've explained it before a few times, often, that as a person, like my views and the way I maybe prioritize my energy and activism, if what I do can be called activism, or the things I stand for, is usually centered around things that are pertaining to, for example, me, being a Black African woman. So I care a lot about issues that happen to women's rights, but also children, and children of all gender, obviously. And the protection of children is very important to me in any way, in any state, in any culture. And protect children, we should always want to be for the things that protect our children. We can all agree on that, if you're queer or not queer. But I'm very impressed by the way that they frame that we need to protect our children from these perversions. They're harming our children. And it's interesting for me because, like, the things we talk about sin, like all sins under God, at least the Christian God, at least the way I grew up, were seen as equal. We learned in my religion, you could be a great Christian your whole life, but then maybe before you died and you didn't get time to repent, you stole something, or you lied, or you were abusive to someone. It doesn't matter what you did, you would still end up the same place as Hitler. Right? Which is another reason why I don't think I could believe in the Bible's God, because for me, with my limited human sinful mind, I can't imagine judging all crimes equally. I can't imagine judging somebody who steals because they're hungry as somebody who committed genocide. Anyway, but that's me. When we talk about harming of children, when we talk about the ways that we have to question all the ways that children are harmed, right? Because if we are living in an Africa where children are protected, children are seen as full beings, and children's well-being is like at the forefront of all parents, right? And this gay agenda is coming in and disrupting that, and they want to harm their children for the first time. Africans, we don't do that. I can understand why there was a need to always relate the existence of gay people and the harming of of children in those conversations. But if it's to protect children from harm, it shouldn't matter which sexual orientation commits the harm. Harm is harm is harm is harm. Abusing your child, whether you're a straight parent or a gay parent, is abuse to the child. We can all agree with that. Having ways of raising our kids that cause them trauma, that cause them to feel less than, that cause them confusion because they don't know who they are, because they don't know how to speak up for themselves, because we've taught them to just exist as little good models for us to be proud of and not as full beings. There's so many ways we abuse children in all cultures, right? If it's to protect children, you'd want to protect children fully, and you'd want to condemn any violation of children that happens regardless of the sexuality of the person committing that crime. This would only make sense if most of the people that use this as an argument could show evidence that the majority of abuse that happens to children is from queer people, which is not the case. This is not what is happening, because we are not even that big of a population. I, growing up and experiencing this childhood trauma, growing up in a violent home, growing up in an unstable home, happened to me from my very straight parents. I myself a product of very straight parents. I was not raised by queer people. I was not influenced by queer people. I didn't even have like proper queer friends until I got later in my life. So nobody talked me into queerness. Nobody, in fact, most of the abuse I experienced as a child was from straight people and straight relationships, right? Don't do that. Like, the abuse of children that happens to children, we should always be fighting against it, and to prioritize the abuse of children from queer people than abuse everywhere else is like saying that kind of abuse affects the child differently, which is not the case. All abuse and neglect and violation of children and their innocence is wrong. I think also, as a member of the queer community here, I would also say, to diversify, that there's also things that are happening in the queer community that I also think are abusive to children. I don't think that that is more or less than what happens in straight or normal community that happens to children, that I also disagree with. Again, I think I'll talk more that in a video by itself, but I would say that we should protect the innocence of children. We should protect their right to develop fully and to not confuse them before they've even understood who they are as humans. And that goes for everybody. We should encourage them also to understand the autonomy of their bodies, to have an understanding of how to talk about things that happen to them in case they need help, in case they're being groomed, in case somebody has violated them. Trying to hide sex entirely and pretending it doesn't help and doesn't make sure that our kids grow up in healthier experiences for their sexuality, whether they turn out to be straight or queer. We need to have conversations that help children understand how to be safe, understand harmful rhetoric that may come from adults or other people trying to groom them, whether those people are being funded by the West or whether those people are being funded by our cultural norms or even our own religion, because let's not forget, we've all heard about all the cases in the Catholic Church specifically of pedophilia. So let's not pretend that this is just something that happens outside of religion, outside of the watch of God, right? Let's be against it in all ways. Anything that violates children, anything that exposes children to sexual content that they should not be in possession of or exposed to at such a young age when their minds are still being developed. So we can agree on that, but that's because I'm trying also, I believe in the consistency, regardless of the person doing it, of protecting children, right? And I would also like to say that in this particular one, I think it's also astonishing, especially when you talk about sexual abuse in general, because this is what the focus is, that children are exposed to being molested by queer people to recruit them to their queer movement. But then when kids are being molested by straight people, are we also saying that being recruited to being straight, or do we just because I know a lot of people, not only in my own circle, that were molested and abused as children, and a lot of them were abused by straight people, like in a straight dynamic, right? But still child and adult, right? And we, even in our own communities, we know of people who have committed either have been pedophiles or have been victims of pedophiles, and what our community does to expel those people, to highlight their immorality, is so interesting, because it's not as loud as if that person was a gay person doing all of that, which makes no sense, because the sexual abuse the child experienced is the same, whether it comes from a straight person or it's coming from a queer person. But we all know certain members, African members of our families, of our communities, that you just tell children to be mindful of, but they're not expelled from their community. They're not blasted for their immoralities and the awful things they do to children. They're not even called the police on, because you don't want to bring shame to the family, right? In many ways, we even encourage protection of those people. Like, let's pray for them. Let's not talk too much about it. Let's not share with everybody what has happened here. But as soon as it's a gay person doing it, it's different. How is it different? Be consistent in protecting children, regardless of who commits the crime. And if you have skeletons of protecting pedophiles in your community, in your family, in other situations where you knew a young person was being groomed by an adult, even if it's a woman or man in a straight dynamic, and you were quiet about that because, oh, it's taboo, but at least it's not gay. Please don't do that. Don't be that person. Be consistent, right? So I find that very hypocritical as well. Another thing is the talk of African family and traditional values, right? I think it's very hard for us to argue for African family and traditional values without taking into how those things came to be. Our Africanness is very much dipped in our heritage of colonialism, of imperialism, of Western ideologies, of Western values, and also Western spirituality, what was brought to us, right? Or foreign spirituality, whether that is, again, Islam or it's Christianity. What we see as African values are not just, they were not like so protected, like in a safe of itself that was not touched by imperialism, colonialism, and the agendas of missionaries and Western missionaries. No, these things were also shaped as those things came into play. The way we see genders, the way we see the gender roles, the way we see what a normal family is, the way we even see, like, you can talk about imperialism and capitalism, but also the enforcing of a more individualistic way of existing, where the family becomes limited to this nuclear dynamic of a mother, a father, and some children, 2 children, what have you. All of those things came to be also because of our historical experiences, and some of them external, and some of them with the agendas that were there to oppress us and enforce other worldviews upon us. So we cannot even talk about African values and African traditions without questioning which is the foundation that we see something as African, right, in today's world. And I also think if there was such a thing as a particular African family value or African gender roles, they would be the same everywhere in the few indigenous cultures that were not overly touched by colonialism and missionaries and Western influence. You would see that they are the same. The way they see the world, the way they see tradition, the way they see sexuality. But that's not the case, because there is no one way. Tradition are formed by the experiences of a collective of people, and then we decide that we want to keep them because they meet, or they create a sense of community, or they have a certain role they play, they have a certain value they add to us, right? And the same we can say for values. Values don't have a nationality. They don't have, you can have good values and bad values. Making something African values doesn't necessarily mean that they're good because they're African values. It means that these are the values that we have collected and accumulated because of our historical experiences, and because of our historical influences, and because of what we've decided to keep and incorporate and to identify ourselves with. But to see them as good just because they're African and say like African values are better or Western values are bad, it's not fair to seeing them in their fullness, right? Who are they benefiting? Who are they oppressing? Who are they inclusive of, right? And just to say that all of these ways of seeing the world like pretty much influenced how we shape families today. So I think when it comes to this and using that as the reason we're against the queer community or are voting against it because it's not African. Me being queer, not once did my heritage or my heritage or my DNA change because it's like, oh, it's not African. It goes like, I'm still African. I'm queer and I'm still African. I'm queer and I'm still Ugandan. And I'm not the first of my line. And I came not from gay people making babies. I came from straight people making babies. People will continue to exist as gay people, as queer people, right? We will always be a small minority, just like in other animal kingdoms, which is another part of it's unnatural, okay? We will always exist in a small minority. It's more like the quality of our existence. And maybe you feel like that's a fight worth having, just like you can understand that, let's say, pedophilia is also something that has always existed. So you might feel like, oh yeah, that has existed. Does that mean that we should always embrace it and welcome it? First of all, I also like to say, which is something they often put together, pedophilia and queer community, whereas pedophilia exists in all sexualities. It's the attraction to young children, whether those children happen to be the same sex as the perpetrator or not, doesn't really matter. Like I said, referring to the other point, all children abuse, all non-consensual sexual interactions should be wrong, right? So just to say that when it comes to African values, let's be aware that those are also not things that fall from the sky and just exist as they are. Those are shaped by our experiences. Just like a person's own personal values are also shaped by their experiences, their upbringing, their culture, their nurture, their traumas, their victories, their failures. All of those things shape what we become and what we value or not value, right? So that was my views on when it came to African family and traditional values. Another thing I think I could talk on that was really echoed, but I feel like it's kind of redundant to repeat it because it goes back to the first few things I said about how the religions we base our values and Africanness on came to be as well, and what we base our ideas of African family and normalcy. And that is the idea that it's because it's Western influence. A lot of people think this queerness and queer existence is the invention of the West. Some people, I hope, are not as ignorant to believe that the West invaded gay people. Because that's not true, obviously. Like, we know that there have been gay people in all cultures for beginning of humankind. It's not something that's foreign to Africa either. Another thing that I wanted to include in this is the views of moral control and the legalizing of morality. When they were asked about what they think is happening in Uganda, and a lot of them saying, that's Uganda, Uganda should have its own rights, right? And they're just trying to protect their culture and their traditions, and like I said, all of these things that are rooted in a history that is not so neutral, right? But I think it's also hypocritical because a lot of the times, especially when it comes to Uganda, this is the same government that we know is the last public agent that should be enforcing morality. Do you understand? Because they are riddled with corruption, they are riddled with theft, they are riddled with violence, and they are riddled with oppression. But at the same time, how do you then justify? But for this particular thing, we need our government to put in law because we need to protect our morality. Even though the government we are giving this opportunity is itself not a moral entity. The current government body is riddled with the opposite of morality. And I also think that goes back to the other things about hypocrisy if we are saying that the government should now come to people's hearts and bodies because you want them to decide who you love and what you do with your body, right? And what kind of sex you have, right? If we get to those very intimate, personal, and private things, what are we opening up for, especially in an already oppressive society? That's why I say, even in the Western world, when we start to manage people and what they can think and what they can say and who they can be supportive of or not supportive of, and we say you're either this or that, you're either with us or against us, there's no understanding, and we use language to decode quickly who is where. Not only language, but we want to put people, like I said, in a box so that it's easier to discard them or include them or exclude them. And I feel like this is also the same thing happening with this particular situation when it comes to involving the government in morality. I think it goes back to even when we see what is happening in Iran or in Afghanistan or in Islamic country where they're using their religion to govern people, meaning there's no space to be anything but that, right? It's interesting for me because even in our own country of Uganda, we're very tolerant when it comes to, as tolerant as I think most countries can be when it comes to religious freedom, right? Like, we live alongside Muslim people all the time. You wouldn't want your fellow Muslim countrymen enforcing their laws of the Quran in our government, because that would maybe inflict on what you believe and what you want to do, right? It's interesting to me that you don't see the hypocrisy of forcing yours in the government so that it can influence everybody's life, even people who are not Christian, who are maybe not even Muslim, right? It's this idea that we want the government to oppress on our behalf because of what we believe in and what we think is moral, because your morality is not universal. It's based on, as you've said so many times, your Christians and Christian upbringing. I saw only one panelist who was Muslim. I saw some who were maybe more spiritual, but a lot of the often they were religious in Christianity. Most of them, the queer community people and queer rights were mostly Christian people. Even though they were saying we're saying this from a place of love, and some of them actually really had some really beautiful points. And I also feel like regardless of what you believe in, if you can have conversation, you can allow people to be different and disagree with you, it's fine. But once we start to enforce things into law that we want for ourselves because of our religion, because we think it's the only religion. And I think that's also what I call having a colonizer's mentality or imperialistic mentality, which goes beyond your race. It can be just the way you think, that you want to colonize other people with your way of seeing the world, with your values, we know that was wrong when it happened to us, but then we use other means to justify that, whether it's in the name of what is African or in the name of what is Muslim, or what is Muslim, or in the name of what is Christian. We're still using a tool that we're using during colonization, which is to infiltrate and enforce your laws and your ways of being and seeing the world. It's the only right way to see the world and the only way to exist within the world. We cannot agree about that, because if you say that you want to do that and you celebrate that the government is doing something on your behalf, or on the fact that a lot of people are a certain religion, I hope you also understand that you've given it the right, with giving it the right to rule over morality, that it can also include other things, like all the people who are born out of wedlock, who have had sex out of marriage, people who are adulterers, There's so many things that can be included as a moral police and that should have harsher punishment. But you guys are not campaigning as a group to go and make sure the government also has strict punishments for those specific immoralities, un-Africanness, right? We value family, we value the traditional family structure. Okay, what are we doing about people who are cheating, people who are lying, people who are deceiving, right? People who are, I know there are laws for certain kinds of abuse and rape and what have you, but what are we doing about the other things that harm a person, like being a dishonest partner, or leaving and abandoning your children, right? Or harming your partner. In Uganda, for example, I've mentioned this before, we have some of the weakest domestic abuse laws in the world. But that is something happening to another person, a form of violation and abuse and exploitation, because even marriage or rape, in some contexts, it's not seen as a crime. Do you understand? There's so many other things that people are clearly, straight people mostly, are imposing on other people. But their sexuality obviously doesn't matter. It's the idea that if we're protecting what is moral, what is correct, what is healthy for the traditional African family, we should want to illegalize all the ways that is disrupted. It's very hypocritical to just choose a specific immorality, whether it's based on your religion or based on your culture, and say that's the thing that we are going to fight against, and that's the thing that we want to make sure that our government, who is also very corrupt and very immoral and happy to cheat, happy to steal, happy to oppress and use violence, but we trust it to help us to enforce our realities on others, because that's what you're doing. I know that for a lot of religious people, they don't see it as their reality. They see it as the only reality, just other people haven't met that reality yet, which is a mindset that naturally wants to enforce itself on other people, because they cannot fathom a world where they can exist and agree with what and be fully passionate and dedicated and committed to their religion, but also being able to say, but you also get to decide what that is for you. It's rare, especially in Africa, you meet people like that who can, unless people are animist or non-religious, when people are spiritual, they are usually more allowing. They can accept, oh, you're a Muslim, this is what makes sense to you, this is the way you live. Oh, you're a Christian. And I was telling that to my mom too, that in my worldview, there's space for her because it doesn't contradict with my worldview. She has the right to have her own religious or spiritual practice. But in her worldview, and also she has the right to be the person she is, love the way she loves, and there's space for her. But in her worldview, it's limiting the way other people can exist, because it's decided everything from right and wrong. And you can either only be right or only be wrong. There is no nuances, there's no expansion, there's no accommodation, there's no interconnectedness. I consider myself more of a spiritual person rather than a religious person. I cannot be courageous enough to be an atheist and believe there is nothing, because I also feel like I've experienced enough in my life to believe that there is something. I just think it already is here. It doesn't need me to advocate for it. It doesn't need me to enforce it on other people. It just is, just like I just am. And I happen to be in all the ways I am in certain ways. I feel like that's a very interesting thing when it comes to that, in feeling comfortable that your government should be a moral police and put laws to punish on basis of immorality, but you don't include every form of immorality. And it's the same, like I said earlier, that all sins are treated equally. So let's put all the sins in the book, right? In the constitution, in the laws. But we don't want to do that because that's too extreme. So it's confusing and it's inconsistent. But then again, I'm not going to say that part. What do you expect? I think also another thing that they mention is that it's unnatural, that this is something that we should fight against because it's unnatural. But like I said with my other visitations of the other arguments, you have to also question what makes something natural, unnatural, who decides what's natural and unnatural. There were some people who were bold enough to say this does not exist in nature, so it should not exist in humans, and that's not true. Homophobia exists in humans. It's the only thing that does not maybe exist as clearly in nature, but homosexuality does exist in nature. And I'll also share like a video that I can share with you. And if we are arguing against illegalizing everything that's not natural, there's also a lot of things that could come into play. How far do we push that boundary, right? Is it contracts? You don't find contracts in nature. Why are we all binded to these contracts? Passports, the inability to travel as you wish, also very unnatural. There's so many things we could argue. The fact that you have to pay till the day you die for a place to live, whereas in nature, you can build something with your own hands or your own resources and you're allowed to live there. We don't do that as humans. There's many things we do that are not natural. You seeing this on the computer somewhere on your phone, it's not natural. So that argument is also, it's not consistent, and it's lacking in grounding if that's the main reason you think it's unnatural. Some people say that homosexuality should not be promoted because it's an unproductive love, like it doesn't create children, and that's the purpose of being humans. To that I think, okay, there were people on a panel who were also talking about that. I am a straight person, but I don't intend to have children. There are queer people who don't want to have children, but there are also people who can't have children. And the argument was like, if you can't, at least you should fight hard to have, because we have to have children. And also that went in line with people arguing that a lot of this is a depopulation agenda, which as a fellow conspiracy theorist, I cannot say that there are agendas to depopulate the earth to some regard, or the agendas of saying that there's too many humans and we need to manage that, but who gets to decide that? So that in a conversation is itself, but the support of this ideology or idea was that being gay will make people not have children, and then Africa will will die because everybody will be gay and nobody will be having children, which is not true. Even to their own contradiction, some of them would say gay people still want to adopt and raise children. So they want to have a family, which is natural, but they don't want to do it in the natural way. But it's like, okay, make up your mind. Either gay people are going to be gay and then we're all going to go extinct because they're going to enforce with their agenda everybody to be gay and be in situations and relationships where they can't have kids and we all go extinct. All gay people are going to also want to imitate the family structures that they want to have, and that is also raising children, whether that's through adoption or having kids by themselves naturally with some assistance. All of that happens, and straight people also do that. They can have kids with certain levels of assistance. So that was also inconsistent. There was also the whole conversation of relating being gay with trauma, as if like you have to have trauma to be gay. I think trauma does influence our sexuality to some regard, or our approaches to sex, or even our fetishes or perversions to some degree. I would be very arrogant to say they have no correlation, especially as somebody who believes in a holistic view of things. Yes, everything can impact everything in a certain degree, but to say that you are gay, you experience trauma, that's why you're gay, it's so simplistic and lazy, intellectually lazy, because there's a lot of people who experience trauma and end up straight. So there's also the trauma that gay people go through when they're experiencing conversion therapy. And there's also even the whole concept of corrective rape, which is something that is rampant in some African countries specifically. I hear a lot about it in South Africa, where you're using raping of specifically lesbian women, right, to make them decide that they want to be with men, which is the most dumbest thing I could ever imagine. Because how would you experience that and be like, I was wrong, I should get a husband, I should get a man instead because I've been raped by men. It's so dumb. And all of these things give space for shit like that. They give things for people to think like that. They think that because this person experienced a gay traumatic experience as a child, that's why they're gay. So if I can correct them sexually by raping them as a straight person in a straight dynamic, they will change. Do you see? Like, there's so many things that when we say without having a holistic whole perspective, we can then go on to perpetuate and encourage really ignorant and harmful ideas that then are perpetuated through action, through violence, through harm of others, right? And those others are not foreign people far, far, far away. That can be your sister, that can be your brother, that can be your father, your mother. You don't know, because in our families, we don't talk about everything. We talk a lot. We don't talk about everything. We're very selective. So the people you are so eager to fight against, even the people who are like pastors and chaplains and what have you, you don't know. You are maybe one child away from somebody telling you, Mom. But I think after you being on panels and saying stuff like that so much, if your kid ever saw all of that, they'll be like, I should not speak about this, because my parent will never understand. And they're so well articulating in fighting against everything I am. Why should I bother? And it's the same conversation I had with my mom. And she was like, where I grew up, there was nobody gay. Nobody's ever been gay. Like, I'm a unicorn created in Denmark. But I had to tell her, Mom, you wouldn't know. Why do you think that people would tell you that? People don't even talk about sexual abuse. They don't even talk about domestic abuse, which is more common, right? They don't even talk about the pedophilia experiences they might have being exposed to as children. Why would you think that somebody who's gay in your family will come and say, hey, auntie, I'm gay, or hey, sister, I'm gay? They'll keep that only for them and God, praying every day. But we know people who are married, who are playing straight lives, but having double lives at the same time. That's not a crazy idea. We've known of that. People living double lives because they have no space to be their full self. So they decide to conform, but you can't fight against what you are, right? And maybe these people resent their partners, resent their children because they're forced into a dynamic that is against who they are. But that's okay. We can work with that. We can keep praying and forcing them until they fit and like that space. It's ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. If there's any human rights perspective that I really connect a lot to, it's the Ubuntu philosophy, when it comes to our own African ways of seeing humanity and each other. And I think even before colonization, I try my very best not to romanticize times before colonization, because not everything was dainty and perfect. And I think even as decolonialists, we have to be aware of that, not to over romanticize or justify or feel that everything beforehand was good. It was only as good as much as it benefited people and protected and cared for people. But I would say that there's something that I really believe a lot in, is the Ubuntu philosophy, and that is that I am because we all are. It is very based in interconnectedness, in equality and equity and togetherness. And it's based on what is good for the whole. I wanted to talk about this part because for me, when I think about what helps us navigate human morality, what is right, what is wrong, I really feel like Ubuntu, the philosophy of Ubuntu, is very holistic in that approach, in the idea that we want to take care of each other. We understand that harming others also harms ourselves. And I think it's also quite aligned with, obviously, because everybody has an agenda. It's aligned with the things I strongly believe in, the things that, and I don't believe them just because of what makes me feel good. I try to believe them in what allows people to be the most, what gives people the most agency over their own lives, the most protection and safety over their own life, and how can we coexist in a way that's respectful of differences and hold space for disagreements, not from a place of conflict and aggression, but understanding the diversity of our experiences as humans, right? So for me, Ubuntu, I feel, is quite well encompassing of that. And that for me is very important. The philosophy of seeing yourself in your fellow humankind beyond religion, this is not something that came to us only because of religion. It's because we are naturally very social beings and we need each other to survive. We need each other to progress. We need each other to grow and heal. And that's why, like, I love these conversations. I thought they were very important because regardless of whatever each side says, we understand each other better, right? I might not agree with everything from the anti-gay rights movement, but I think what we can all agree, was something that the human rights panelists on the video I saw today mentioned, is that these are about human rights and our dignity as fellow humans, and that nobody has the right to oppress another person just because they don't fit into their worldview, right? And we can all agree any form of abuse, any form of non-consensual interactions with other people sexually or what have you should not be tolerated in our communities. And we can all agree that the abuse of children is always wrong, but we can all agree that we're not going to support our governments in making it easier for them to be more invasive in our personal and private lives and personal and private choices. And I think when you're so blinded by one worldview and you're so blinded by fear and animosity, but on one-sidedness, it's easier for you to vote into ideas or even vote laws into your social existence that you think for now are protecting you against the other. But soon you will be that other, and you would have created a path, you would have created a way for the government, you would have created a way for power structures, which we already know in most African countries are not really that trustworthy. You'd have created a passage into that to oppress you as well. And that's the short-sightedness I feel in a lot of people who are so adamant on not only celebrating such a hateful bill and such a personal invasive bill, but also a bill that gives more power to authority and authoritarianism. But I also feel like as Africans, because we grew up in such authoritative social settings, and we believe that people should have power over. We see that from people of different ages, people of different genders, people of certain classes. We have a society that kind of is really moved and navigated through who has power over who. And also oftentimes I think that's also why when people then get power, it's not power they see as a form of sharing and opening up more power for other people, but we all then become hoarders of power because we knew what it felt to not have power and to be under the power of others. And so we use that power in a way that oppresses other people below us because we feel that I have now the power to protect myself and my interests, so I'm going to use that power to suppress and push down anybody who does not agree with that, right? In everything I would fight for, I'd always still fight for, even though, which was a very challenging thing, like fighting for tolerance for people who believe in things that preach intolerance. It's really complicated. But even despite everything I've shared, I think it's still important for me to stand fast in that, because I recognize if I would do anything or enforce something in a law that says people should not believe in religions that have to be enforced on everybody, then I'm also opening up the way for maybe in the future for that to be me. I'm not allowed to be spiritual. I need to belong to a certain thing that is approved by government entities. And I don't want to live in a world like that. So because I'm also interested in my freedoms, I want to protect your right to believe in even things that do preach certain forms of intolerance, right? But at the same time, I hope you can see that as an ability for you to recognize that when you vote things that are hateful, when you vote things that make other people less than human, because your worldview is the all-encompassing. And it's good. It shows you are committed to your worldview. But it's a sad thing that your worldview is so all-encompassing, you cannot imagine that other people can live full lives, happy, peaceful lives, and not be a part of your worldview. For them, for you, they're always playing a role in your worldview because your worldview is very codependent on everybody else playing into it, rather than actually acknowledging, okay, this is for me, this is what I believe in, this is what's important for the way I see the world. And I'm happy that I live in a country that allows me to be Christian, even though they're Muslims, even though they're Hindus here, even though they're Jewish people here, and even though they're animist people here. Like, I'm happy to be part of a country that allows everybody to believe what they believe in, right? And that also includes allowing people to live as they want to live and love who they want to love and sleep with who they want to sleep with. I think those would be my closing thoughts on that. There's a lot of hypocrisy in the things that we say and do, and nobody's above that, not even me. I think there is a level of hypocrisy we all meet, or contradictions we all meet to some degree. But when they're so strong, when there's such a strong lack of consistency, I think we should question, how do we feel so grounded and so committed to something that is not that consistent, and not only grounded in it for ourselves, because it's one thing if you are lenient in your own way of living with the principles you hold dear, but then to be bold enough to enforce it on other people while you yourself are not enforcing them all on yourself in the many ways that they should be enforced if you are fully committed, as you say you are, enough to enforce it on other people who have nothing to do with you, right? So that was a very interesting discovery. And I think it also opened me a lot up to how much the colonial discussions are very important for us as Africans, because that was the one elephant that came in here and there, but not fully. And it felt like from the Christian perspective, they have totally separated Christianity from colonialism, which I think is very convenient, but again, inconsistent when we're talking about foreign influences. But that is that. As I said in my previous video, we exist, and we will continue to exist as queer people. It's only the amount of dignity and fullness we can live our life that you have power over, but not our existence. No amount of bills, no amount of morality, superior morality, no amount of hatred can alleviate the world from queer people, because we've always been here. On top of that, I think these conversations are very important because I think they'll invite other ways of seeing the world that perhaps we didn't always have open discussions around. Also, I got to know a lot of activists and people on the ground working with things that I think are important that now I'm aware of and can be more educated on from the ground. I think so. But I really loved ending it on, we can understand that we all are because we each are, and what we do to each other, we do to ourselves. And if we care for the freedom and rights and existence of ourselves, we have to protect that ability for other people as well, even if we disagree with them. But we can all agree that there's certain parts of our society that can be identified as crime, as harmful, as violent, as what you call it, violation to other people's autonomy and agency and desires over their lives, manipulation. But that is not just limited to the queer community. That shows up in so many ways in our societies, even in our families, right? And we should be against that in every form, to be consistent with caring so much, to be decent and honorable people. Right? But that's my video. It's been a long one. I hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. If there's things I've missed, I'm sure I didn't cover everything, but the things that stuck out the most. Otherwise, I will see you in my next video. As I always say, stay kind, but don't take no shit from anybody for any reason. Anyway, I'll see you in my next video. Take care. Bye.